The town of Fairhaven was still waking up, its streets bathed in the soft golden light of an early spring morning. The cobblestone pathways glistened with the remnants of last night's drizzle, and the crisp air carried the scent of fresh bread and morning dew. A few shopkeepers were already pulling up their shutters, letting the first rays of sunlight filter into their stores, but most of the town remained in a sleepy haze. The only true signs of life came from Carter's bakery, where the warmth of a burning oven had long melted away the lingering chill of dawn. Inside, Emma Carter wiped her flour-dusted hands against her apron and peeked at the clock. Nearly 8. She had to hurry. The bakery, a small yet beloved cornerstone of Fairhaven, had been in her family for generations. It wasn't just a shop, it was home. Every surface, every wooden shelf filled with golden loaves and delicate pastries carried the imprint of her father's hard work. But today, they were running low on vanilla extract and cinnamon, and those were things no proper baker could do without. She quickly untied her apron, grabbed her woven basket, and stepped outside, inhaling deeply. The town square was just beginning to stir, with merchants setting up their stalls, their chatter blending into the calls of seagulls overhead. The scent of freshly brewed coffee wafted from the cafe across the street, mingling with the aroma of warm croissants. Emma adjusted her shawl and quickened her steps. She had walked this path 100 times before, the familiar shortcut through the marketplace, past the bookstore where Mrs. Whitmore would be dusting off old classics, past the clock tower that chimed every quarter hour. She loved this town, its predictability, its simplicity. But as she turned the corner near the general store, someone, unexpectedly disrupted that comforting familiarity. Alexander Reynolds had always stood out in Fairhaven. He wasn't just the son of one of the wealthiest families in town, he carried himself like it. Tall, with sharp features and dark, intense eyes, he had an effortless air of confidence. His presence commanded attention, whether he sought it or not. And this morning, he was distracted, flipping through a newspaper as he stepped out of his family's chauffeur-driven car. Neither of them saw it coming. 1 second, Emma was walking briskly, her mind occupied with cinnamon sticks and measurements. The next, she crashed directly into him. The impact sent her basket tumbling to the ground, and with it, the glass bottle of milk she had just purchased. It shattered instantly, spilling white liquid across the cobblestones. The bag of flour she had tucked under her arm burst slightly at the seams, sending a fine cloud of powder into the air. For a moment, there was silence, then mortification. Emma dropped to her knees, hands scrambling to gather what remained. "I'm so sorry, I wasn't looking," she stammered, cheeks flushing. Alexander blinked, momentarily stunned, before quickly crouching down to help. His hands closed around a rolling apple before it could escape into the gutter. And as he handed it back to her, his gaze locked onto hers. She had the kind of eyes he had only ever read about. Deep, sea-green pools that reflected the world in a way that made everything seem softer, more alive. For a moment, he forgot what he was supposed to say. The world around them faded, the bustling morning market, nothing but a distant hum. But Emma, flustered beyond words, broke eye contact almost immediately. She snatched the apple from his hand, murmured a hurried "thank you," and continued gathering the rest of her scattered groceries with quick, precise movements. A chuckle escaped him. Light, amused. "Do you always storm through town like a runaway carriage?" Her fingers clenched slightly around the handle of her basket. There it was, that rich boy arrogance she had heard so much about. She had no time for it. She stood, brushing flour from her sleeves, and shook her head. "Only when I have places to be." He watched as she turned and walked away, her long, honey-brown hair swaying slightly with each step. For a brief moment he debated letting her go. But something inside him, something unfamiliar, told him he would regret it if he did. "Wait," he called, taking a step forward. "At least let me replace the milk." Emma hesitated, but only for a fraction of a second. "That won't be necessary," she said without looking back. And just like that, she was gone, disappearing into the crowd like a fleeting breeze. Alexander exhaled sharply, running a hand through his dark hair. His driver, Mr. Hensley, a man who had known him since childhood, cleared his throat from a few feet away. "Shall I take you home, sir?" Alexander barely heard him. His eyes were still fixed on the path where she had disappeared. Who was that? He murmured, half to himself. Mr. Hensley chuckled, shaking his head. That, sir, is Emma Carter. And if I were you, I'd tread carefully. She's not the kind to be impressed by a Reynolds. Alexander smirked, shoving his hands into the pockets of his coat. Good, he mused. That makes things interesting. Little did he know, this was only the beginning. The following morning, Emma pushed open the wooden shutters of Carter's bakery, letting the crisp air of early spring sweep into the small shop. The scent of warm dough and vanilla filled the room, mingling with the earthy aroma of freshly ground coffee beans. She'd spent most of the night trying to forget about the ridiculous encounter from the day before. The dark-haired, sharp-tongued man who had nearly turned her morning routine into a disaster. Alexander Reynolds. His name was whispered in town often enough for Emma to be vaguely aware of him, but beyond that, she had never cared much. She had always assumed he was just another entitled heir to a fortune too large to appreciate. But the way he had looked at her, the way he had lingered even after she walked away, unsettled something inside her. Pushing the thought aside, she tightened the knot of her apron and turned toward the counter, where a small queue had already formed. The bakery, though modest in size, was known throughout Fairhaven for its pastries. It was the kind of place where customers came not only for the food, but for the warmth and the sense of belonging that Emma and her father had cultivated over the years. And then, just as she was handing an old gentleman his morning scone, she saw him. Alexander stood just outside the shop, leaning casually against the doorframe as if he had all the time in the world. He was dressed in a tailored navy coat, his dark eyes flickering with something between curiosity and amusement. It took everything in Emma not to roll her eyes. Good morning, Miss Carter. His voice was smooth, unhurried, as if they were old acquaintances exchanging pleasantries. She glanced at him briefly before turning her attention back to the tray of croissants. We open at 6. If you wanted breakfast, you should have come earlier. He chuckled, stepping inside. I'm not here for breakfast. Emma sighed inwardly. Of course he wasn't. She had seen this game before. Men who thought a few charming words and well-placed smiles would win them anything they wanted, but she was not so easily moved. If you're here to replace the milk, she said, stacking warm baguettes onto the counter, I already told you it wasn't necessary. And yet, he said, reaching into the pocket of his coat, I insist. Before she could protest, he placed a fresh bottle of milk on the counter. She looked at it, then at him. You really didn't have to do that. I know. Something in the way he said it made her pause. He wasn't smirking anymore, nor was there any trace of arrogance in his tone. He was just watching her, as if trying to understand something he couldn't quite grasp. Emma exhaled, shaking her head slightly before grabbing a paper bag and filling it with 2 warm pastries. She placed it beside the milk. Here, consider us even. A flicker of surprise crossed his face, but he took the bag without argument. Then I suppose I'll have to come back tomorrow if I want to buy my own. She let out a soft, incredulous laugh. You don't even like pastries, do you? Alexander tilted his head slightly as if considering her question. I suppose I'll find out. And with that, he turned and walked out, leaving her standing there, wondering what in the world just happened. Over the next few weeks, Alexander found every possible excuse to stop by the bakery. At first, he told himself it was simple curiosity. Emma Carter was unlike anyone he had ever met, unimpressed by his name, indifferent to his presence. He had grown up in a world where people either sought his approval or resented his wealth. But she treated him as though he were just another customer, and perhaps that was why he kept coming back. At first, Emma tried to ignore him, but it was impossible. He had a way of inserting himself into her routine, showing up just before closing to rescue the last forgotten loaf of bread, or lingering at the counter long enough to ask about the recipes she used. And against her better judgment, she found herself answering. One evening, after a particularly long day, she stepped out of the bakery to find him leaning against the lamppost outside, watching the street lamps flicker to life. You don't seem like the type to enjoy quiet nights, she remarked, crossing her arms. Alexander glanced at her, a small smirk forming. And what type am I exactly? The type that prefers expensive parties and fine dining over small-town bakeries. He laughed at that. a genuine, rich laugh that made something unfamiliar stir in her chest. Perhaps I used to be. She raised an eyebrow. And what changed? He hesitated, then looked at her in a way that made her heart stutter. I met someone who makes simple things seem extraordinary. Emma swallowed, looking away before he could see the effect his words had on her. That's a dangerous way to think, Mr. Reynolds. Call me Alexander. She hesitated. Then, before she could stop herself, she whispered, Alexander. He smiled. Better. For the first time in years, Emma felt something shift, something terrifyingly real. And deep down, she knew she was already in trouble. The world had never seemed more perfect than it did that evening. The golden glow of lanterns bathed the town square in warmth, and laughter drifted through the streets as families closed their shops for the night. In the heart of it all, Emma stood in the doorway of Carter's bakery, her apron dusted with flour, watching as Alexander paced just outside, hands shoved deep into his pockets. There was something different about him tonight. Something restless, almost nervous. She wiped her hands against her skirt and stepped closer. You look like a man with something on his mind, she said softly. He turned to her, exhaling sharply. I do. For weeks now, he had been building up to this moment. Every late-night conversation, every lingering touch, it had all led to this. His heart pounded, but when he looked at her standing there beneath the warm glow of the bakery lights, he knew. He wasn't afraid. Taking a deep breath, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Alexander? I love you, Emma, he said, voice steady despite the storm inside him. And I don't care what anyone says. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. The world around them seemed to blur as he dropped to one knee, opening the box to reveal a delicate ring. Simple, understated, but perfect. Emma's hands trembled. She loved him. God, she loved him. And yet, before she could find the words, the sound of hurried footsteps shattered the moment. Alexander. The voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. Emma turned just in time to see two figures approaching, Reginald and Eleanor Reynolds, Alexander's parents. A chill ran down her spine. She had never spoken to them before, but she knew who they were. Everyone in town did. Reginald, a tall man with a face carved from stone, barely spared her a glance before focusing on his son. Get up, he commanded. Alexander didn't move. No. His father's expression darkened. This nonsense ends now. It's not nonsense, Alexander shot back, rising to his feet. I love her, and I'm gonna marry her. Emma could feel Eleanor's cold gaze settle on her, appraising, calculating. You think you can marry into our family? She asked, voice smooth as silk yet laced with venom. Emma stiffened but met her gaze head-on. I never asked for anything from you. Eleanor's lips curved into a tight, humorless smile. And yet here you are, taking everything from us. Enough, Alexander snapped, stepping between them. This isn't your decision. Reginald's face turned red with fury. You are a Reynolds. You have responsibilities. My only responsibility is to the woman I love, Alexander countered, voice sharp with defiance. Reginald's jaw tightened. Then, after a long pause, his voice dropped, quiet and dangerous. If you marry her, you will lose everything. The words hung in the air like an axe poised to fall. Emma's heart clenched. She had known, of course she had known, that they would disapprove. But this was worse than she had imagined. Alexander's hands curled into fists. I don't care about the money, the title, any of it. I only want Emma. Reginald's eyes darkened. Then you leave us no choice. Emma barely had time to register the meaning behind those words before Eleanor stepped forward, her voice smooth as polished steel. Your father has already arranged everything. By the end of the week, you'll be on a ship to England. You will study, you will build your future, and you will forget about this foolish infatuation. A knife twisted in Emma's chest. Alexander recoiled as if struck. You can't do this. Eleanor tilted her head. Watch us. Emma saw it, the flicker of panic in his eyes. But more than that, she saw the war raging within him. His entire life, he had been trapped in a world of expectations, of obligations he had never wanted. He had spent so long fighting against them, and now they were tightening their grip, pulling him away. Alexander turned to her, desperate. Emma, I won't let them. You don't have a choice, Eleanor cut in. Emma's breath shuddered. She had always known that loving Alexander would come with challenges, but she had never imagined this, never imagined standing on the edge of losing him. Then all right, Alexander said, voice raw. Every day, I'll find a way back to you. Emma nodded, though the words felt hollow. And I'll wait for you. Reginald scoffed. No, you won't. Emma's stomach turned. What does that mean? Reginald turned to Eleanor. She reached into her handbag and pulled out an envelope. It took Emma a moment to realize what it was. Money. Cold, hard bills are placed between them like a transaction. Eleanor held it out to her. Take this and let him go. Emma's blood ran cold. You think you can buy me? Eleanor smiled as if amused. Everyone has a price, dear. A bitter laugh escaped Emma before she could stop it. You don't understand love at all, do you? Eleanor's smile vanished. Emma turned to Alexander, ignoring the shaking in her hands. I don't want your money, she said firmly, staring directly at his parents. I only want him. For the first time, Reginald hesitated. Alexander reached for her, gripping her hands like she was the only thing keeping him grounded. Emma. Reginald's voice cut through the moment like a blade. Get in the car, Alexander, now. Emma felt his grip tighten. His eyes, full of love, full of promise, searched hers. But then, hesitation, fear. Emma's heart shattered. And then, without another word, Alexander let go. Emma barely registered the sound of the car door slamming shut. The engine roared to life. She didn't move, didn't breathe, as the vehicle disappeared down the road, taking him away from her. It was only when the last trace of its taillights vanished that the first tear slipped down her cheek. The first few weeks after Alexander's departure were unbearable. Emma woke every morning with the same hollow ache in her chest, a feeling of loss so deep it made it hard to breathe. The bakery, once a place filled with warmth and joy, now felt suffocatingly small, as if the walls were pressing in on her. Every corner held a memory of him. The way he'd leaned against the counter with that infuriating smirk, how his fingers had brushed against hers when he reached for a pastry. The sound of his laughter mingling with the crackling fireplace in the winter. She refused to believe this was the end. He had promised, he had sworn he would write. And so she waited. The first letter arrived exactly 10 days after he left. The envelope was slightly crumpled, as if it had been handled too many times before reaching her hands. Her fingers trembled as she tore it open, eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. My dearest Emma, I don't know how to put this into words, but every day without you feels like a punishment. I wake up in a city that is not my home, surrounded by people who see me only as an obligation. But through it all, I hold on to you. I picture you standing at the bakery window, flour dusted on your cheek, smiling in a way that makes the world seem right. Please tell me you are waiting. Tell me you believe in us as much as I do. Love, Alexander. Emma pressed the letter to her chest, exhaling shakily. He had written. He hadn't forgotten her. She wrote back that very night, pouring every ounce of longing into ink-stained pages. She told him of how the bakery felt emptier, how she missed the way he filled the space with his presence. She assured him she would wait, no matter how long it took. But the days stretched into weeks, and no reply came. She wrote again and again. Each letter was sent with the same desperate hope, but the silence remained. At first, she convinced herself there was a reason. Perhaps his studies kept him too busy, or the postal service was slow. But as months passed with no word, hope began to fray at the edges. Had he changed his mind? Had he found someone else? Doubt whispered cruelly in the quiet hours of the night. One evening, as she stood by the bakery counter, staring at the fading light outside, her father approached her with careful steps. Emma, he said gently, you can't keep doing this to yourself. She forced a smile, though it barely held. He promised, Papa. He said he would come back. Her father sighed, placing a hand on her shoulder. Sometimes people make promises they can't keep. The words stung, but she refused to believe them. Across the ocean in the cold halls of a London estate, Alexander sat at his desk, frustration curling his fingers into fists. He had written Emma every week since he left, pages filled with love, longing, and the promise that he would return. But no reply had come. His mother entered the room, her expression composed, yet her eyes sharp. You look troubled, darling, she said smoothly. Alexander clenched his jaw. Why isn't she writing back? Eleanor feigned innocence. Perhaps she's moved on. His chest tightened. No, Emma wouldn't. His mother sighed, shaking her head. You were always so naive when it came to that girl. Do you really think someone like her would wait forever? He didn't believe it. He couldn't. But doubt was an insidious thing, and it crept into his mind like a slow poison. It was only weeks later that he discovered the truth. Late one night, while searching his father's study for financial papers, he found them. A stack of letters, unopened. Emma's handwriting. His heart nearly stopped. Ripping one open, his eyes devoured the words. Alexander, why haven't you written? Are you well? Have I done something wrong? Please, tell me you haven't forgotten me. His hands shook as he read letter after letter, each one more desperate than the last. His stomach churned with rage. They had kept them from him. Eleanor stood in the doorway, expression unreadable. You never intended for me to have these, he whispered, voice trembling. Her lips pressed into a thin line. You don't belong in that life, Alexander. He stared at her, disbelief giving way to fury. You had no right. She lifted her chin. I had every right. I am your mother, and I will not watch you throw away your future for a baker's daughter. His grip on the letters tightened. You don't get to decide who I love. Eleanor's eyes darkened, and yet, here we are. His heart pounded violently against his ribs. The realization hit him like a freight train. Emma must think he abandoned her. She must have spent months waiting, hoping, only to believe he had broken his promise. He had to go back. Ignoring his mother's protests, he stormed out, determined to return to Fairhaven. Back in Fairhaven, Emma stood outside the bakery watching the autumn leaves swirl around her feet. The first snowfall would come soon, another season passing without him. She had stopped writing weeks ago. Perhaps he had changed. Perhaps she had been nothing more than a fleeting love, easily forgotten. The pain of it was suffocating. As she turned to go inside, a voice stopped her. Emma? She froze. The voice was unfamiliar, yet somehow it sent a shiver down her spine. Turning slowly, she found herself face to face with a young man in an elegant coat holding a small package. He hesitated. I work for the Reynolds family. There's something I need to give you. Confused, she accepted the package. It was worn as if it had traveled across the world and back. Her fingers trembled as she unwrapped it. Letters. Dozens of them. All were addressed to her. Her breath caught as she pulled one out, recognizing his handwriting instantly. Tears blurred her vision as she read. Emma, I don't know if this will ever reach you, but I need you to know, I never stopped writing. I never stopped loving you. If you still believe in us, please, wait for me. I will come back to you. I swear it. The world tilted beneath her feet. He hadn't forgotten. He had never forgotten. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but this time they weren't of loss. They were of something else entirely. Hope. The wind carried the crisp scent of autumn through the streets of Fairhaven as Emma stepped out of the bakery, the warmth of freshly baked bread still clinging to her skin. The air was cool but not yet biting, and the sky above was painted in soft hues of amber and violet as the sun dipped toward the horizon. It had been weeks since she had found the letters, weeks since she had learned the truth. And yet, despite the overwhelming emotions that had flooded her, relief, heartbreak, anger, there was still one thing missing. Him. She had read every word he had written, each letter a whisper of longing that had spanned across the years. And still he had not come. Maybe it was foolish to think he would. Maybe too much time had passed. Maybe, just maybe, she had held on to something that no longer existed. She shook off the thought and adjusted the strap of her basket, forcing herself to focus. She had errands to run, and standing there, lost in memories, would not bring him back. As she turned onto the main street, she walked past the familiar storefronts, the little bookstore with its dusty windows, the cafe that always smelled of roasted hazelnuts, and the tailor's shop where Mrs. Whitmore sat by the window stitching lace. Life had continued moving forward, even when hers had stood still. Then, just as she rounded the corner near the general store, she collided with something. No, someone. The impact sent her stumbling, the basket slipping from her fingers. Apples rolled across the cobblestone street, and a bag of flour burst open, sending a fine cloud of white into the air. It was as if the world had rewound itself, replaying a moment she had thought lost forever. Emma's heart pounded as she looked up. And there he was, Alexander. Time had barely touched him, and yet everything about him felt different. He stood taller, his shoulders broader, his features sharper. His dark eyes, once filled with youthful arrogance, now carried something deeper, something heavier. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world around them blurred, muffled by the pounding of her heart in her ears. Then, as if afraid that speaking would break whatever fragile thread connected them, he bent down and picked up the apple nearest to him. His fingers brushed against hers as he handed it back. Déjà vu. Emma swallowed, forcing herself to steady her voice. You're back. Alexander exhaled, something flickering in his gaze. I promised I would be. Her fingers tightened around the apple, the weight of years pressing against her chest. She had imagined this moment so many times, what she would say, how she would feel. But now that he was here, standing before her, the words refused to come. Why didn't you come sooner? The question escaped before she could stop it, her voice barely above a whisper. He ran a hand through his hair, his jaw tightening. I tried. God, Emma, I tried. But my parents, he exhaled sharply, shaking his head. They kept everything from me. The letters, the truth. By the time I found out, so much time had passed, I didn't know if you'd still be here. Her throat tightened. I waited. He let out a shaky breath. I know. The silence stretched between them, thick with everything unsaid. Then, she did what she had done the last time they had met like this. She bent down, gathering what had fallen, grounding herself in the motion. But this time, he didn't just stand there. This time, he knelt beside her. Emma hesitated, glancing at him from the corner of her eye. I read every word you wrote, she murmured, fingers brushing against the torn edges of a paper bag. Alexander swallowed hard. And I read yours. She straightened, dusting flour from her skirt. And now? He stood with her, his gaze steady. Now I ask if it's too late. The words were so quiet, so careful, as if he feared the answer. Emma looked at him, the man who had once been a reckless, arrogant boy, the man who had become someone entirely different, yet still the same. Her heart ached. She didn't know how to begin again, but she wanted to try. Come by the bakery tomorrow morning, she said at last, gripping the handle of her basket. His brows furrowed slightly. Emma, she shook her head. If you mean what you say, then come. We'll see what happens next. A beat of silence. Then, slowly, a small, tentative smile touched his lips. I'll be there. She nodded once, then turned, walking away before her resolve could break. As she stepped back into the warmth of the bakery, she placed a hand over her chest, feeling the steady rhythm beneath her palm. For the first time in years, hope didn't feel like a distant memory. It felt real. The morning light filtered through the bakery windows, casting golden streaks across the wooden floor. The scent of warm bread and vanilla lingered in the air, yet Emma could hardly taste it. Her hands were steady as she arranged the fresh pastries on the display, but her heart was anything but. He would come. She knew he would. And yet she wasn't prepared for what came next. The small brass bell above the door chimed. She didn't look up immediately. She needed a moment, just one more breath before she faced him again. But then his voice cut through the quiet hum of the morning. Emma. Slowly she lifted her gaze. Alexander stood just inside the doorway, dressed in a dark coat that still carried traces of the crisp autumn air. His eyes, deep and unreadable, searched hers with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. He stepped closer, hesitation flickering across his face. May I? She nodded toward a corner table. Sit. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of years hung between them, heavier than the silence. Finally, she exhaled. Why now? His hands rested on the table, fingers curling slightly against the wood. Because I spent too long believing a lie. Her breath hitched. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a bundle of letters. Her letters, worn and slightly crumpled as if they had been read 100 times over. I found them in my father's study, he said, voice laced with quiet anger. They took everything from me, Emma. Every word you sent, every chance we had. Emma's fingers clenched around the edge of the table. I thought you had forgotten me. His jaw tightened. I never did. I write to you every week. I begged for answers. And when I didn't hear from you, I thought you had moved on. A bitter laugh escaped her. And I thought the same of you. He shook his head. I wanted to come back. But they controlled everything. My education, my finances, even my ability to leave the country. It took years before I was able to break free. And when I finally did. He hesitated, eyes darkening. I was afraid I had lost you forever. She swallowed past the lump in her throat. You should have come anyway. I know. His voice was rough with regret. A long silence stretched between them. Then softer, she asked, why did you? His gaze softened. Because no matter how much time passed, no matter how much they tried to erase you from my life, you never left me. You were always there, in every decision, in every regret. I had to see if there was still a chance. Emma's chest ached. How many years had been stolen from them? How many nights had she spent lying awake, believing he had chosen to walk away? Her father's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes people make promises they can't keep, but Alexander had kept his. It was just the world that had torn them apart. She reached for the letters, running her fingers over the familiar handwriting, the ink slightly smudged from time and use. Emma, he murmured, drawing her attention back to him. She met his gaze, searching for something. Assurance, clarity, the truth she had been too afraid to hope for. And she found it. The same love that had once been so bright, so consuming, still burned in his eyes. A tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it. Alexander's hand moved, hesitating for only a moment before gently wiping it away. I should have fought harder, he whispered. She shook her head. You're here now? The words were simple, but they carried more meaning than anything else she had said. He exhaled a slow, unsteady breath. And I'm not leaving again. For the first time in years, Emma let herself believe it. The past had stolen so much from them. But maybe, just maybe, they could still have a future. The bakery was quieter now. The morning rush had passed, leaving behind the scent of cinnamon and fresh bread lingering in the air. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting golden patches onto the worn wooden floors. Emma stood behind the counter, kneading the dough with steady hands, but her mind was elsewhere, drifting between memories of the past and the fragile hope of what lay ahead. It had been weeks since Alexander returned. Weeks of careful conversations, of relearning each other, of confronting ghosts they had both thought long buried. And yet, the more time they spent together, the more she realized something profound. Time had not diminished what they once had. If anything, it had only strengthened it. She heard the familiar chime of the doorbell. She didn't need to look up to know it was him. Alexander walked in with the easy confidence that had once infuriated her. But now it just felt like home. He carried a small bouquet of wildflowers, nothing extravagant, but thoughtful in a way that made her chest tighten. For you, he said, placing them on the counter. Emma wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron before taking them. The scent of lavender and rosemary filled the air. You don't have to bring me flowers every time you see me, she murmured, but the corner of her lips curved slightly. He leaned against the counter, smirking. I know, but I like seeing you smile. She shook her head, setting the flowers aside before returning to her work. You're insufferable. And yet, here I am, still standing in your bakery every morning. There was something easy about their banter now, something natural. The sharp edges of pain had softened, making room for something warmer, something real. He watched her knead the dough, his eyes following the movement of her hands. I spoke to my father yesterday. Emma stilled for a moment before resuming her work. And? He finally admitted it, Alexander said, his voice quieter now, that he never should have interfered, that he was wrong to take those years from us. Emma exhaled slowly. She didn't know what she had expected, but she supposed it didn't matter. The past was the past. It couldn't be undone, but they could still choose where to go from here. And your mother? She asked carefully. A humorless chuckle escaped him. She's still convinced I've ruined my future. Emma smirked. Well, at least she's consistent. Alexander shook his head, but there was amusement in his eyes. I don't care what they think, Emma. Not anymore. She glanced at him then, really looked at him, and saw the truth in his words. He had changed, not just in the way he carried himself, but in the way he saw the world. He was no longer the boy who sought approval from a family that never truly saw him. And what about you? He asked, his voice softer now. What about me? His gaze didn't waver. Do you still believe in us? The question settled between them, heavy with everything it carried. Emma wiped her hands on a cloth, turning to face him fully. She thought about the girl she had been all those years ago, standing in this very bakery, waiting for a man who never returned. She thought about the night spent wondering if she had imagined it all. if love had been nothing more than a fleeting illusion. But then she thought about the letters, the proof that he had never stopped loving her. And she thought about now, about this moment, about him standing here, waiting for an answer. Slowly, she stepped around the counter, closing the space between them. I never stopped believing, she admitted, even when I wanted to. A slow smile spread across his face, one of quiet relief and something deeper, something certain. Then marry me, he said simply. Emma's breath hitched. His hands found hers, fingers warm and steady. Not because of what we lost, but because of what we can still have. Because I want to spend every morning walking through this door and seeing you here. Because I want to build a life with you. No more waiting. No more letters. Just us. Here now. Tears burned at the corners of her eyes, but she laughed. A breathless, disbelieving sound. You're serious, he nodded. Completely. She searched his face, looking for any trace of doubt. But there was none. Just certainty. Just love. And for the first time in years, she let herself choose happiness. Yes, she whispered. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her close as the world outside the bakery continued on. But for them, in that moment, nothing else existed. The wedding was simple, a small gathering in the courtyard behind the bakery, surrounded by close friends and the scent of fresh bread baking in the ovens. Emma wore a dress her mother had once sewn, delicate lace tracing the edges of her sleeves. Alexander looked at her as if she were the only thing in the world that mattered. When they exchanged vows, there were no grand speeches, no elaborate declarations, just two people who had found their way back to each other against all odds. Just love. Years later, as the sun set behind the hills of Fairhaven, Emma sat on the porch of their home, a steaming cup of tea cradled in her hands. The scent of warm bread still lingered in the air, mixing with the evening breeze. Alexander sat beside her, his fingers gently tracing over hers. Their children played in the yard, their laughter echoing through the quiet streets. She turned to him, smiling. Did you ever think we'd end up here? He chuckled, pressing a kiss to her temple. Not for a second. She laughed softly, resting her head against his shoulder. No more waiting, no more lost years, just them. Together. Always.